Kilikabiju na denawema, kinikichi nishnabek oguming, nadonjaba, nagojuan megwadoda, batasamusak, machisa lik nishnabek nosuing, nikichinendam gibajayat, bibwach and guk, Clayton, Tanis, Tom, Chimigwich gibajayat, Gichi nishnabek elders, Chimigwich for the beautiful songs when we came in. Chimigwich for the traditional opening. It's always very beautiful to hear that Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving address. And Miigwich for the Benesi song. I am Pitasmusak and I am Mississauga from Alderville First Nation near Coburg, Ontario. I come here tonight with a good heart and a good mind because as an Anishinaabe, I support your movement. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me here to this very important gathering. I'd like to begin by welcoming you to Mississauga and Anishinaabe territory, to the part of our territory we share with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. I'd like to acknowledge that ancient treaty that we have with the Haudenosaunee. We call it Gedo Naganina in my language, our dish. The Haudenosaunee call it the dish with one spoon. It's the idea that in this, the parts of our territories that we share, we're eating out of the same bowl, we have those same ecological connections, and so it's very important that we have a lot of ceremony and protocol that go into keeping the peace and to nurturing our relationship with those lands. I'm here tonight because I share your anger at a system that places corporate greed, corporate profits, and corporate interests above all else. I share your anger at a system that is built on the exploitation of land, of life, and of indigenous people. And because I'm the local person on the panel, I'd like to take you back tonight, about 300 years ago, to my homeland, and I'd like to just describe it for you. Lake Ontario, which we call Chiknabish, or Big Water, had its own resident population of salmon. They've migrated all the way up to Stony Lake to spawn. We drank directly from the lake, and that was a good, healthy thing to do. There was a large population of eels that also migrated to Stony Lake each year from the Atlantic Ocean. There was an ancient old-growth forest of white pine that stretched from Curve Lake down to the shore of Lake Ontario that had virtually no understory except for a bed of pine needles. There were tall grass prairies and black oak savannas where Peterborough stands today. And on the south shore of Rice Lake, which we call Pimadash Kodeyang, Pimadash means going across, and it refers to the burning of those prairies in order to maintain it. Our lake was teeming with monomen, or wild rice. The land was dotted with sugar bushes. The lakes were full of fish. It sounds idyllic because it was idyllic. And the knowledge systems, the education systems, the economic systems, the political systems of indigenous peoples were designed to promote more life. They were designed to promote intact ecological systems. We were not capitalists. Capitalism isn't an indigenous concept. Our way of living was designed to generate life, and not just human life, but the life of all living things. Over the past 200 years, without our permission and without our consent, we have been systemically removed and dispossessed from most of our territory. We have watched as our homeland has been stolen, clear-cut, subdivided, and sold to settlers from Europe and later cottagers from Toronto. We no longer have salmon in our territory. We no longer have eels in our territory. We no longer have old-growth white pine forests in our territory. Our rice beds were nearly destroyed. All but one tiny piece of prairie in Alderville has been clear-cut to farmland. And 90% of our sugar bushes are under private ownership. Our most sacred places have been made into provincial parks for tourists with concrete buildings over our teaching rocks. Our burial grounds have cottages built on top of them. The veins of our mother have lift locks blocking them. The shores of every one of our lakes and rivers has a cottage or a home on it, making it nearly impossible for us to even launch a canoe. Our rice beds have been nearly destroyed by raised water levels from the Trans-Severn Waterway, boat traffic, and sewage from cottages. And the Haudenosaunee, the Cree, the Anishinaabeg, and the Métis have all of Ontario's industry within our territories and all of Ontario's population. Our children have been stolen from us and sent to residential schools, day schools, and the child welfare system, and now into an education system that refuses to acknowledge our cultures, our knowledge, our histories, and our Indigenous experiences. And then, of course, there's the Indian Act, which until 1951 made our ceremonies illegal, made it illegal for us to hire a lawyer, made it illegal for us to leave the res without permission of the Indian agent, and made it illegal for us to organize. The Indian Act still controls virtually every decision and every aspect of our lives from birth to the grave. It is a continuous system of control over Indigenous people. Which brings us to 1923, when the Williams Treaty was signed and the Crown dishonorably took away our hunting and treating rights, which was a direct attack on our ability to feed ourselves. Our Mississauga grandparents grew up eating squirrel and groundhog because if their parents were caught hunting deer or fishing, they were criminalized. The Haudenosaunee had a similar experience, and I'm going to read a passage from, written by Mike Mitchell, who is from Akwesasne, in a book called Drumbeat. In 1898, clan mothers from Akwesasne sent a letter to the government indicating that they would continue to follow their own political traditions and that they would not participate in a system of governance being imposed upon them. The state responded by sending in a police force to enforce an election. It didn't happen. 9 months later, they tried again and were met by 200 Mohawks who surrounded the schoolhouse where the election was to take place. The state then responded by sending police to the community at 4 a.m. on May 1st, 1899. They sent a message to the chiefs that there was a meeting to discuss the buying of stone to build the collapsed pier at the Cornwall Bridge. Instead, they threw the chiefs to the ground and handcuffed them as they walked into the building. When head chief Jake Fire came through the door and demanded the release of the chiefs, he was shot dead. The other 7 chiefs were removed from the community and imprisoned. Immediately after this, the government took 15 Mohawks to Cornwall, provided them with alcohol, and told them to each nominate one of the others present. And there you have the first Indian Council at Akwesasne. This is how my ancestors, my family, and my relations have experienced occupation. This is what occupation looks like to me because my ancestors and my family have spent the last 400 years surviving under a system that has brought countless waves of gendered violence, colonialism, conquest, and dispossession. Occupation has tried very hard to erase us from this land. This political and cultural genocide is what Canada is built upon. Stolen natural resources from Indigenous land fuel 100% of the natural resource sector of the economy. And so here we are in 2011. And the Anishinaabeg are still picking our wild rice, and the Haudenosaunee are still planting their corn. We're still making maple syrup. We're still holding our ceremonies and speaking our languages, and we're still fighting to protect our lands. And those clan mothers at Akwesasne and Six Nations are still engaged in their traditional governance. And that is no accident. That's a direct result of 400 years of resistance, which is the longest social movement in Canada because it predates Canada. Woo! Maintaining a movement for that long means you have to have a multi-pronged approach. And I know that you're familiar, I hope you're familiar with Oka, Eperwash, Caledonia, Grassy Narrows, KI, Ardoch, etc., etc., etc. And I know that you're familiar with the good work of the IAN and Clayton and Tom. But resistance isn't just direct action and protest. Sometimes just surviving is resistance. Building a cultural and political resurgence based on Indigenous values, philosophies, and traditions is resistance. Sometimes having the will to live is resistance. Giving birth to and raising our children to know their responsibilities as indigenous people, to have a connection to their homelands, to speak their languages, and to tell their stories is resistance. In my own urban community of Peterborough, we have all kinds of examples of resistance. The woman that started Nichkiwendada, our shelter for women, and the ones who continue to work hard to run it. Those ones at Ngorjoonan Friendship Center, the one that started the Bamadzalin School, the one that runs the Odeimengizis Festival every year, the medicine woman that runs our sweats, our fasts, and heals us when we are sick, that auntie that made all those dictionaries and CDs and books so we wouldn't have any excuses not to learn Anishinaabe, the one that dreamt our Nojem theater into existence, and the one that protects Nojem and keeps us dancing, always dancing, that one that keeps bringing us artists to keep our children's eyes dancing, those little ones that dance at our powwows with their jingles and their fancy shawls, the one that carries the little boy, the one that's the midwife, the one with the court case, the one that knows about those teaching rocks, the one that makes those songs, the one that makes those movies, the actors, the playwright, the producer, the poet and the little poet, all those storytellers, the professor, the one that looks after those Nanataguk, the ones that block the road and stop the uranium prospecting, the language teacher that walks around the lakes and takes care of Nokomis Dibigizis, the one that lets us build our lodges in our backyard, the one that's always clowning around and keeps us laughing, the one that works in the jails, the one that grows our food, the one that takes care of the rice, that artist that keeps mending our hearts back together, the berry fasters, those Cree singers and dancers and writers that came to share, those Haudenosaunee women who are our closest sisters, all the ones that gave birth and breastfed and cared for the next generation, and those people exist in Toronto, and they exist in Six Nations, and they exist in Grassy Narrows and Attawapiskat. They exist even though they're not on TV or in the mainstream media, even though they're not seen by the vast majority of Canadians, even though you don't see them at protests. They are doing the very, very hard work of rebuilding our families, our communities, and our nations. And the strength and resilience of our nations comes in part because our systems of government allow for and encourage a diversity of leaders, and because so many of our leaders are mothers, aunties, and grandmothers. And so it's very, very important to me that we acknowledge that hard work and the leadership of our women. And I'm here today and able to speak to you today because of that love, that commitment, that perseverance, that strength, and the resistance of the Indigenous women in my life. The three of us are here today because of the love and the commitment and the perseverance and the strength and resistance of Indigenous women. Early on in my life, I worked with a number of environmental NGOs, and I always heard, why aren't there any natives here at our protest? Or, we need more Indigenous people in our organization. Or why aren't there more of your friends, Leanne, working in solidarity with us? And those comments always bothered me because they erased that 400 years of Indigenous resistance. They erased that 400 years of Indigenous people fighting to protect our lands from industrial development, from hyper-environmental exploitation that has become so normalized. And so I'm excited and I'm hopeful to see you all here visioning a different future, a future based on equality, diversity, and a respect for the land. And I'm excited and I'm hopeful for the impact that you're having on the world. And so I say to you today that if you wish to align yourselves with the dispossessed and the marginalized, reject the language and the ideology of colonialism, conquest, and exploitation. As my Dakota colleague, Wazetiwan, told Occupied Oakland, Distinguish yourselves from the builders and the players of Wall Street. Place decolonization at the center of your movement and abandon the language of occupation. And if you want to be really, really brave and radical, place the concerns and the issues of indigenous women at the center of your deoccupation.